University campuses have once again become a lightning rod for free speech. Last week, 3 university presidents, Harvard's Claudine Gay, Penn's Liz McGill, and MIT's Sally Kornbluth, appeared before Congress to testify about rising anti-Semitism on their campuses.
I am asking, specifically calling for the genocide of Jews, does that constitute bullying or harassment?
If it is directed and severe or pervasive, it is harassment.
So the answer is yes.
It is a context-dependent decision, Congresswoman.
Calling for the genocide of Jews does not constitute bullying and harassment?
I have not heard calling for the genocide for Jews on our campus.
But you've heard chants for intifada.
I've heard chants, which can be anti-Semitic depending on the context.
Anti-Semitic rhetoric, when it crosses into conduct that amounts to bullying, harassment, intimidation, that is actionable conduct, and we do take action.
So the answer is yes, that calling for the genocide of Jews violates Harvard Code of Conduct, correct?
Again, it depends on the context.
All 3 presidents have since faced calls for resignation. Many high-profile donors have threatened to pull millions in funding from these universities. One of these presidents, Liz McGill of UPenn, has already since resigned. Over the last few days, these developments have entered the cultural zeitgeist, so much so to the point that even the likes of Dave Portnoy have gotten involved, tweeting, "One down, 2 to go." Some university faculty have pushed back on such efforts to censor free speech on campus, one of them being Professor Walter Johnson of Harvard.
In these past few weeks, I've become wary of my own words, of speaking my mind, of being overheard in a way that I have not been afraid since the days, and then the weeks, and then the months after 9/11 when I was living in New York. And people who I had thought were my friends literally lost their minds, their composure, their sense of proportion, and their basic human decency. And I see that happening again with the ferocity that has astonished me. I am aware of the irony of standing before those of you who have been singled out and targeted, doxxed, harassed, and blacklisted, to warn you that the boundaries of what you can safely say are closing in.
So joining us today is Walter Johnson, Professor of History and African American Studies at Harvard University. Thank you for being with us today, Professor.
It's my pleasure.
First question, what compelled you to make such a public statement regarding free speech on campus?
I think in the first instance, it was the palpable climate of fearfulness among many of my colleagues and many of my students. I guess I'd have to say I felt called to speak up. Many of the students were. I felt it was important for somebody on the faculty to speak up and stand with the students. I was also, I think at that moment, aware of things that later came to light about actual censorship happening at Harvard Law School, which was where that event took place, in the case of one student who had been involved in a protest and the university president had issued a statement condemning the phrase "from the river to the sea." So I think in some sense that was an early response to a climate of intimidation and fear that I feel like has only become has only intensified in the meantime.
You mentioned the phrase "from the river to the sea." Now, for a phrase like that could mean different things to different groups of people. Some, like Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, say it's in a quote, aspirational call for freedom, human rights, and peaceful coexistence. Other groups like the ADL deem it to be a call for ethnic cleansing against Israeli Jews. For such phrases like this, how can we consistently apply the First Amendment right to free speech?
What you said is exactly right. I mean, you said that it's been read to imply different things. I don't think that within that broad spectrum, there's a lot of room for contestation and debate. So one of the letters, one of the many letters that I've been involved in over the past couple of weeks said was, well, the university needs to slow down. The university needs to slow down, not to condemn statements, but to encourage investigation and debate. That's what a university should do. And I think, again, that was, I don't want to get too braggy about it, but that was prescient, right? Because within a week, it comes out that this, comes into general knowledge. There were specialists who knew this, that this very statement appears, this very phrase appears in the Likud founding platform. So clearly, it's history, and multiple meanings need to be discussed. It can't simply be condemned.
Yeah, I want to get your perspective more on what's going on at the universities. The fallout of Harvard's Claudine Gay, Penn's Liz Magill, and MIT's Sally Kornbluth. Collectively, in the mainstream media, their testimony has been seen as many as a disaster. All three presidents have since faced calls for their resignation, major donors threatening to withhold millions of dollars in donations. Penn's Liz Magill has already since resigned. So what do you think? Does this set the right precedent for the future of university discourse?
So I think that, to me, that hearing looked McCarthyite. I do not think that a congressional investigation of words said on a college campus in which college presidents are asked whether or not they believe in the principal values of another country is an appropriate um, mechanism of appropriate usage of state power. I think it's a dangerous usage of state power. Now, I will say this, and I'll say this straight up. I think that there has been speech made on the Harvard campus that approached the advocacy of genocide, because there was an affiliate of the university who stood in Harvard Yard and implied that students at Harvard supported terrorism, and said the words, those who justify terrorism are lower than animals. I believe that was an episode of genocidal speech made on the campus of Harvard University. And as far as I know, there's been no coverage outside of a brief mention in the Harvard Crimson of that. There's certainly not been a congressional investigation of that. And as far as I know, that individual has not been subjected to university discipline. So again, I think that, part of what's happening is we're living in a shadow world where there is an inordinate amount of attention paid to certain types of speech, very little attention of the same sort of attention being applied to other types of speech at the very same moment that there is an actual material, real life mass murder, removal, Nakba genocide, not to mention the history of the last 75 years.
Yeah, I want to ask you, it's a slight pivot, but I want to ask you about the consistency of free speech on campus, because some have likened Harvard, other elite universities' newfound commitment to free speech as somewhat inconsistent. They're insinuating this kind of anti-Semitism is a factor in this. People have brought up some past examples of universities having no problem silencing those who were critical of, say, BLM, DEI, LGBTQ right. ideology. So is it fair to say that there is a level of hypocrisy that underlies these rationalizations? Could there be something more sinister, like I just alluded to? Is this criticism fair?
I think that's an important question. I think it's an important question to answer forthrightly. I believe in the first instance that the joining of the attack on DEI, on diversity, equity, and inclusion, to the attack on anti-Zionist speech, or even speech that is critical of Israel, is baleful and dangerous. Okay, but I am myself someone who thinks that the regulation of speech and civility on college campuses has come at this point to serve the universities as an alibi, universities like my university, as an alibi for the sorts of inequality that they represent and perpetuate. And so I think in a way that the weaponization of the terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion is related to the way that those terms themselves have become unmoored from a larger understanding of justice.
Yeah, last question for you is how do we, because it seems to me free speech is kind of one of those things, to your point, people love free speech if they agree with that speech, and they will silence speech that they don't agree with. So moving forward, how do we consistently apply free speech?
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm not sure there's a consistent application. Because I think it's always going to be a field of political contest. And so then the focus for me is on, well, how do we imagine ourselves speaking in a way that is insistently honest and also generous? And so for me, that does not involve the sort of activity that I think has been, for quite a while now, we've been living in a world where the words free speech on campuses are associated with the right. And they are generally performed through acts of provocation. Right. I think that this campus is not ideologically diverse, and so I'm going to bring in an extreme speaker who's bound to offend. Well, what if we imagine our commitment to free speech, like to the freedom part? What if we imagine it is not something that's defined by our ability that we're allowed to do harm with our words? What if we imagine it as trying to really speak honestly, to really pursue justice? That's what I've been, thinking. And that's not to say that doesn't, plenty of that is going to involve saying things that make other people unhappy or uncomfortable. Saying that the state of Israel is an apartheid state, which I think it is. Right? But I don't say that because I want to do harm. I'm not trying to prove some kind of point by that. I'm not trying to prove I'm allowed to say that. I say that because I think it's true. And what if we just hold ourselves to that standard? I think that would be, that's the world that I want to live in, and that's the world that I think is um, under threat from any variety of directions. And to come back to your first question, I guess that's why I felt compelled to speak out about any of this in the first place.
Well, thank you, Professor. This has been incredibly insightful. Thank you for your time today. If this continues on, I'm sure it will. We hope to have you back in the future. Appreciate your time.